A war-hardened ex-soldier turns night shift taxi driver, just trying to leave his dark past behind, until three strangers hijack his cab, threatening everything he loves. But when the tables turn and his deadly skills resurface, you'll never guess who truly needs saving. The city was a mosaic of flickering lights and restless shadows, its heartbeat a cacophony of honking horns and distant sirens. Miguel adjusted the rearview mirror of his battered yellow taxi, his dark eyes scanning the empty streets as he waited for his next fare. Night shifts were his routine, a monotonous yet safe space to drown out the echoes of his past. His phone buzzed in the holder, the screen lighting up with the name Sofia. Miguel's expression softened. He swiped to answer, his voice warmer than the cool January air slipping through the cracked window. "Hi, querida. You home safe?" "Yes, Dad," Sofia's voice replied, laced with teenage impatience but grounded in affection. "You don't have to check every night." Miguel chuckled softly, gripping the wheel a little tighter. "I do. You're all I have, and the city isn't exactly forgiving." "I know, Dad," she said, her tone softening. "Did you eat? You've been working so much." Miguel glanced at the half-empty coffee cup sitting in the console. "I'm fine. Focus on your studies, okay? That scholarship is your ticket out of this crazy place." "I will. Good night." "Good night, Sophia. I love you." The line disconnected, leaving Miguel alone again with the hum of the engine and the murmur of the city. His thoughts drifted to unpaid bills and Sophia's tuition, a financial tightrope he walked every day. But he couldn't let her see his worry. She had enough on her plate. A knock on the passenger side window snapped him out of his thoughts. Three young men stood there, their expressions a mix of impatience and bravado. Miguel unlocked the doors and they piled into the back seat, filling the car with the sharp scent of cheap cologne and adrenaline. "Where to?" Miguel asked, his voice steady. "Just drive," the one in the middle said, leaning forward. His tone carried a hint of authority, his eyes scanning Miguel as if sizing him up. Miguel noted the tattoos snaking up the young man's neck, the nervous tapping of the other two. He'd seen this dynamic before. One leader, two followers. Trouble. "Listen, if you don't have a destination," Miguel began, but the leader cut him off. "Drive," he repeated, his voice sharp. Miguel's instincts flared, the kind honed over years of life or death decisions in another world. He gripped the wheel and started the car, his calm exterior masking the storm brewing inside. As they sped down the avenue, Miguel glanced at them through the rearview mirror. The leader was whispering to his companions, their laughter low and conspiratorial. Something was off. "You guys heading to a party?" Miguel asked casually, trying to keep the conversation light. "Yeah," one of the others replied, but his voice lacked conviction. The leader shot him a glare, silencing him. Miguel's pulse quickened. He'd been in enough dangerous situations to recognize when a plan was unfolding, and he was certain it involved him. The question was, how far would they go? The leader leaned forward again, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You know, old man, you've got a nice little setup here. Taxi's a good cover for things." Miguel's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone neutral. "I just drive people where they need to go." The leader smirked. "Good. Keep doing that." As the city blurred past, Miguel's mind raced. He didn't know their exact intentions yet, but he could feel the weight of their stares, the barely concealed threat in their laughter. For now, he played along, but the thought of Sophia and the life he'd built for her sharpened his focus. He wouldn't let anything jeopardize it. Not tonight, not ever. The silence in the taxi grew heavy, punctuated only by the faint hum of the tires against the asphalt. Miguel kept his breathing steady, his hands loose on the wheel, though every nerve in his body screamed to brace for what was coming. The leader, now lounging back in his seat, toyed with something in his pocket. Miguel caught the movement in the rearview mirror. A glint of metal confirmed his suspicions, sending a jolt through him that he carefully masked. His training had taught him the importance of patience, of waiting for the right moment to act. "Pull over," the leader said suddenly, his voice calm but commanding. Miguel glanced at the curb ahead, a shadowed stretch of road away from the city's bustle. He complied, easing the taxi to a stop, though his mind raced to assess the situation. The three men shifted, tension crackling in the confined space. The leader leaned forward, his face close enough for Miguel to catch the faint scent of cigarettes on his breath. "We're gonna need your wallet, your phone, and anything else you've got." Miguel's jaw tightened, but his expression remained neutral. "I don't carry much cash," he said evenly, reaching for his wallet. He handed it over, watching as the leader rifled through its contents with a smirk. "You're a funny guy," the leader said, holding up the thin stack of bills. "Where's the rest?" Miguel met his gaze in the mirror. "That's all there is. I'm a cab driver, not a bank." The leader's smirk faded, and he pulled out the gun. It was small, likely a cheap model, but it was still deadly. He pointed it at Miguel, the barrel steady in his hand. "Don't lie to me," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You've got a nice car, a decent job. You've got more." Miguel's stomach churned, but he stayed calm. He didn't flinch, didn't give them the satisfaction of fear. "Look, take whatever you want. I just want to go home to my daughter." "Your daughter, huh?" the leader mused, exchanging a glance with one of his companions. "Bet you'd do anything for her." Miguel didn't respond, his silence deliberate. Every second he kept them talking was a second closer to finding a solution. He noted the twitch in the leader's left hand, the way the other two fidgeted nervously. They weren't professionals, they were desperate. "Start driving," the leader ordered, gesturing with the gun. "And no funny business, or we'll pay your kid a visit." Miguel's grip on the wheel tightened imperceptibly as he pulled back onto the road. They'd crossed a line. Sofia wasn't just his daughter, she was his reason for everything. He kept his face blank, but inside a fire ignited. He complied for now, but his mind was already calculating. They thought they were in control, but Miguel had survived worse. And he wasn't about to let anyone threaten his family and walk away unscathed. The street stretched ahead, illuminated by the dim orange glow of streetlights. Miguel drove in silence, the tension in the taxi palpable. The leader, whose name Miguel had overheard as Renan, sat back with an air of false confidence, his gun resting on his lap. The other two whispered occasionally, their nervous energy contrasting Renan's feigned calm. Miguel kept his focus on the road, but his mind churned with calculations. Every move Renan made, every word spoken, was cataloged and assessed. Miguel wasn't a victim. He was a predator forced into a cage, biding his time to strike. Renan's phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket, glancing at the screen before answering. "Yeah?" he said, his tone sharp. Miguel's ears pricked up, sensing the importance of the call. The conversation was brief, but what came next tightened the knot in Miguel's chest. "Change of plans," Renan said, snapping his fingers for Miguel's attention. "Take a left up ahead. We're meeting someone." Miguel complied silently, his knuckles whitening on the steering wheel. Renan turned to one of his companions, a lanky, jittery boy who couldn't have been more than 20. "Call him," Renan ordered, shoving his phone into the boy's hands. The boy hesitated, his fingers trembling as he dialed. The phone rang once, twice, before the call connected. Miguel couldn't hear the other end of the conversation, but Renan leaned forward, his voice icy and deliberate. "You make sure everything's ready when we get there," he said, his eyes flicking to Miguel. "And tell him we've got leverage if things go south." Leverage? Miguel's stomach twisted as Renan gestured at him with the gun, a cruel smirk tugging at his lips. "See, old man, I've been thinking. A guy like you, family man, hard worker, you wouldn't want anything bad happening to your kid, would you?" Miguel's pulse quickened, though he forced his expression to remain impassive. "Leave her out of this," he said, his voice low and firm. Inside, a storm was brewing. He could feel the tether holding him to restraint fraying with every word. "Relax," Renan said with mock reassurance. "As long as you behave, nothing happens. But if you try something stupid..." He let the implication hang in the air, his smirk widening. The weight of the threat pressed down on Miguel, but it also sharpened his resolve. Memories surfaced, years of covert operations, missions that hinged on split-second decisions and the ability to outthink opponents. This wasn't his first brush with danger, but this time, it was personal. He thought of Sofia, her laughter, her determination, the way she hugged him tightly whenever he came home late. The image burned into his mind, fueling the fire building in his chest. They had no idea who they were dealing with, and Miguel was about to show them. Renan leaned back, satisfied with his display of power, as Miguel turned onto the designated street. The road ahead was quieter, the buildings taller, their shadows looming. Miguel's grip on the wheel relaxed, not in surrender, but in preparation. He had decided. No one would threaten his daughter and live to tell the tale. The city's towering buildings gave way to quieter streets, where warehouses and abandoned lots painted a desolate landscape. Miguel followed Renan's instructions without a word, his senses razor sharp. Each turn was deliberate, each moment a step closer to what he knew would be a confrontation. Renan sat smugly, the gun resting on his lap like a talisman of authority. The other two shifted uneasily in the back seat, their earlier bravado waning as the night deepened. Miguel could sense the cracks forming in their unity, a tension he planned to exploit. "Right here," Renan ordered, pointing to a secluded alley between two decrepit buildings. Miguel slowed the taxi and pulled over. The silence in the car was deafening as the engine idled. Renan glanced at him, eyes narrowing. "Turn it off." Miguel complied, the sudden stillness amplifying every sound. The distant hum of traffic, the faint creak of a swaying sign, the shallow breaths of the men behind him. As they stepped out, Miguel scanned his surroundings. The alley was dimly lit, bordered by high walls streaked with graffiti. A perfect spot for an ambush or a trap. His training kicked in, cataloging exits, potential cover, and weaknesses in the group's positioning. "Over there," Renan gestured with the gun, directing Miguel toward the shadowy end of the alley. "Let's have a chat." Miguel obeyed, moving slowly, deliberately, his hands at his sides. Renan and the lanky accomplice flanked him while the third remained near the car, fidgeting nervously. They were disorganized, inexperienced, a flaw Miguel planned to exploit. As they reached the alley's end, Miguel stumbled slightly, his foot catching on a loose piece of debris. He cursed under his breath, crouching to steady himself. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to palm a jagged piece of metal from the ground. He hit it against his leg as he stood. "What's this about?" Miguel asked, his tone even, though his mind raced. He needed to buy time to create an opening. Renan smirked, his confidence oozing. "It's simple. You're gonna help us make a deal. Your cab makes it easy to move things, no questions asked. Tonight's just the start." Miguel's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. "And if I say no?" Renan's smirk disappeared. He raised the gun, pointing it directly at Miguel. "That's not really an option, old man." At that moment, the fidgeting accomplice called out from the car. "Hey, there's someone coming!" Renan turned his head, distracted, and Miguel seized the opportunity. With practiced precision, he stepped forward, slamming his elbow into Renan's wrist. The gun clattered to the ground as Miguel twisted his arm, using the metal shard to pin him against the wall. The lanky boy froze, his eyes wide with shock. Miguel's voice was low and cold. "You made one mistake. You underestimated me." Renan struggled, but Miguel's grip was ironclad. The tide had turned and the stage was set for what came next. Miguel's grip on Renan's arm tightened as the leader struggled, his face contorting in a mix of anger and pain. The jagged piece of metal pressed against Renan's neck, just shy of breaking the skin. The others stood frozen, their youthful bravado crumbling into fear. For a moment, Miguel had the upper hand, but the scene around him began to blur. His mind betrayed him, pulling him into memories he had fought so hard to suppress. The sharp smell of gunpowder, the cries of wounded comrades, the oppressive heat of a battlefield, it all came rushing back. He was no longer in a dark alley. He was halfway across the world, knee-deep in chaos. The memory was vivid. A routine operation turned nightmare, his team ambushed by an enemy they underestimated. Explosions thundered in his ears, his commanding officer yelling orders drowned by the cacophony of war. Miguel had barely made it out alive. The guilt of leaving his team behind had haunted him every day since. "Hey!" Renan's voice cut through the haze, snapping Miguel back to the present. "You gonna stand there all night, or are you gonna let me go?" Miguel blinked, his grip faltering for just a moment. Renan took advantage, jerking his arm free and stumbling backward, putting distance between them. Miguel cursed under his breath, shaking off the lingering shadows of the past. He couldn't afford to lose focus now. "Big man with a tough past, huh?" Renan sneered, rubbing his wrist. "I've seen that look before. You're broken, old man. You think you're better than us, but you're just another guy who couldn't handle his own mess." The words struck a nerve, but Miguel didn't let it show. Instead, he straightened, his eyes cold and calculating. "You don't know a thing about me." "Maybe," Renan said, smirking. "But I know you care about that kid of yours, and that's enough for me." The threat was clear, and Miguel's anger flared, but he forced himself to stay calm. This wasn't about pride or vengeance. It was about survival, his and Sophia's. He glanced at the lanky boy and the third accomplice, who stood by the taxi, clearly torn between running and helping. "You too," Miguel said, his voice commanding. "Do you really want to go down for this guy? Because trust me, you're not ready for what comes next." The lanky boy hesitated, his gaze darting between Miguel and Renan. Miguel saw the doubt, the fear, and beneath it, the spark of a conscience. It reminded him of younger soldiers he'd trained, boys forced into battles they didn't understand. Before Renan could bark another order, Miguel stepped back, tossing the shard of metal to the ground. "Enough of this," he said, his voice steady. "We can end this now, or you can keep pushing me. But I promise if you do, you won't like where this goes." Renan's jaw clenched, but the others took a step back, clearly unnerved by Miguel's quiet confidence. The tension hung in the air like a drawn bowstring. Miguel fought to suppress the memories clawing at the edges of his mind, but they remained, a reminder of the man he once was, and the man he could become if pushed too far. For now, he had to stay one step ahead, keeping his past from consuming him and his enemies from realizing the depth of his scars. Miguel's heart beat steadily as he backed away from Renan, his instincts fully in control. The alley felt smaller now, the shadows pressing in as the tension thickened. Renan was seething, his confidence cracked, but not broken. The other two were visibly shaken, their loyalty faltering. Miguel's experience taught him that fear and doubt could unravel even the tightest groups. Renan snatched up the gun from the ground, his movements hurried and clumsy. "You think you've got the upper hand?" he barked, his voice laced with frustration. "You're just a washed-up old man who got lucky." Miguel didn't respond. Words wouldn't diffuse the situation now. Action would. He glanced at the other two. The lanky one avoided eye contact, fidgeting nervously, while the third stared at the gun in Renan's hand, clearly second-guessing his choices. "Stay where you are," Renan growled, raising the weapon. Miguel froze, his body relaxed but ready to react at the slightest opening. The barrel trembled slightly, a crack in Renan's resolve. "You don't have to do this," Miguel said evenly, his voice cutting through the tension. "Whatever you're running from, it's not worth dying for." Renan's eyes narrowed, but Miguel saw the flicker of uncertainty. Before Renan could retort, a sudden noise echoed through the alley, a car horn blaring from the street nearby. All heads turned instinctively toward the sound, and Miguel seized the moment. He lunged forward with practiced precision, striking Renan's wrist. The gun discharged with a deafening crack, the bullet ricocheting harmlessly off a metal dumpster. Miguel twisted Renan's arm, forcing him to drop the weapon again. Pain flashed across Renan's face as Miguel shoved him backward into the wall. The lanky boy yelped, stepping back further, his hands raised in surrender. The third accomplice bolted toward the mouth of the alley, disappearing into the shadows. Miguel didn't chase him, one less threat to handle. Renan staggered to his feet, his face twisted with rage. "You don't know who you're messing with," he spat, pulling a switchblade from his pocket. Miguel took a steadying breath, his body coiled like a spring. The blade flashed in the dim light as Renan lunged. Miguel sidestepped with fluid grace, grabbing Renan's wrist and twisting it sharply. The knife clattered to the ground, and Miguel delivered a swift elbow to Renan's ribs, sending him sprawling. The lanky boy, still rooted in place, looked on with wide eyes. "Stay down," Miguel commanded, his voice firm. Renan groaned, clutching his side, but the fire in his eyes hadn't dimmed. Miguel retrieved the gun, holding it carefully by the barrel. He pointed it at the ground, keeping it out of Renan's reach. "I'm done playing," Miguel said, his tone cold. "This ends now." The lanky boy finally spoke, his voice shaky. "I didn't want this, I swear, I just—" "Then walk away," Miguel cut him off, his gaze sharp. "Before you get dragged any deeper." The boy hesitated, glancing at Renan, who glared at him with venomous disdain. Finally, he turned and ran, leaving Renan alone with Miguel. For the first time, Renan's bravado cracked. He leaned against the wall, breathing heavily, his hands raised slightly. "What now, hero? Gonna shoot me?" Miguel stared at him, his expression unreadable. The gun felt heavy in his hand, its weight a reminder of what he'd left behind, the violence, the guilt, the blood. Slowly, deliberately, he disassembled the weapon, tossing its components into the alley's shadows. "I don't need to," Miguel said quietly. "You've already lost." Renan's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. The fight had left him, replaced by something closer to defeat. Miguel stepped back, keeping his guard up. The city sounds returned, filling the silence with their indifferent hum. As Miguel turned toward the taxi, he felt the weight of the night settle on his shoulders. The battle wasn't over, not yet, but the tides had shifted. He had taken control, and now it was time to finish this, on his terms. Miguel leaned against the taxi for a moment, catching his breath. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the confrontation began to ebb, replaced by the familiar weight of exhaustion. He glanced at the alley's mouth, where the lanky boy had disappeared, and then at Renan, slumped against the wall, clutching his ribs. The night had been long, but it wasn't over. As he prepared to climb back into the driver's seat, a faint sound caught his attention, a muffled sob. Miguel turned toward the source, finding Diego, the youngest of the group, crouched behind a stack of crates near the alley's end. "Hey," Miguel called out, his voice softer now, but still firm. "Come out." Diego hesitated, his thin frame trembling as he stepped into the dim light. His face, barely older than a teenager's, was streaked with tears. He looked at Miguel with a mix of fear and shame, his hands raised defensively. "I didn't want to be part of this," Diego blurted, his words tumbling over each other. "Renan, he said it was just going to be a quick job. I swear I didn't know it would turn out like this." Miguel studied him, the boy's raw vulnerability tugging at something buried deep within him. He could see the fear in Diego's eyes, but also regret, the kind that only came from realizing you'd crossed a line you couldn't uncross. "You made a choice," Miguel said, his tone steady but not unkind. "And choices have consequences." Diego flinched, nodding quickly. "I know, I didn't have a choice. My mom, she's sick and we don't have money for her medicine. Renan said this would fix everything." Miguel's expression softened, though he kept his posture firm. He'd heard this story before, in different forms, from different faces. Poverty, desperation, and bad influences. It was a cycle that trapped people like Diego, pulling them into darkness with promises of escape. "Running with guys like Renan won't fix anything," Miguel said, stepping closer. "You're only digging yourself deeper." Diego lowered his gaze, shame washing over him. "I know, I messed up." For a moment, Miguel didn't speak. He thought of his own past, of the mistakes he'd made, and the people he'd lost because of them. He thought of Sofia and the promises he'd made to be a better man for her. And in Diego, he saw a chance to break a cycle, even if it was just for one person. "You want out of this?" Miguel asked, his voice quieter now. Diego nodded furiously. "Yes, please. I don't want to be like them." Miguel studied him, weighing the risks. Finally, he nodded. "Then leave. Go to your mother. Do what you need to do to fix things the right way." Diego's eyes widened, hope flickering through his fear. Without another word, he turned and ran, disappearing into the night. Miguel watched him go, the weight on his chest growing heavier. He knew he couldn't save everyone, but sometimes one was enough. The alley was still and quiet now, save for the distant hum of traffic. Renan sat against the wall, his breathing labored and shallow. Miguel stood a few feet away, his eyes fixed on the man who'd spent the night trying to break him. Yet, despite everything, there was no satisfaction in Miguel's gaze, only a weary determination. "You're not getting away with this," Renan spat, his voice hoarse but defiant. He shifted slightly, wincing as the pain in his ribs caught up with him. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're just a guy who got lucky." Miguel didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he crouched down, his elbows resting on his knees, as he leveled a steady look at Renan. "You had a choice tonight. Why do this? What made you think this was the answer?" Renan scoffed, though the edge in his voice wavered. "What do you care? You don't know a damn thing about me." "Maybe not," Miguel said calmly, "but I know desperation when I see it. So tell me, what's your excuse?" For a moment, Renan said nothing, his jaw clenching as he stared at the ground. Then, with a bitter laugh, he shook his head. "You really want to know? Fine. My mom's dying. Cancer, the kind that eats you alive and takes everything you've got with it. Doctors? They don't work for free. Medicine might as well be gold. And my little brothers? They're too young to understand why everything's falling apart." Miguel's expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes, something that made Renan's words hit harder. Renan noticed and pressed on, his voice rising with frustration. "You think I wanted this? That I wanted to spend my nights robbing guys like you, hoping I don't get caught or killed?" I don't have a choice. Nobody does when the system's rigged against you. Miguel leaned back slightly, his gaze unwavering. He saw the anger in Renan, the pain buried beneath it. It was the same anger he'd seen in the mirror after losing his comrades, the same frustration at a world that seemed indifferent to suffering. Hurting other people won't fix it, Miguel said quietly. It won't save your mother or protect your brothers. Renan's laugh was sharp and hollow. What do you know about saving anyone? You think you're better because you didn't pull the trigger tonight? You're just like the rest of us, trying to survive. Miguel's jaw tightened, but he didn't let the words sink too deep. Maybe I am, he admitted. But I made a promise to myself and to my daughter. I'm not crossing that line again. Renan stared at him, the fight in his eyes dimming. For the first time, Miguel saw something other than defiance, a flicker of understanding, perhaps even regret. Why didn't you just end it? Renan asked after a long pause. You had me. You could have stopped all this. Miguel stood slowly, his voice calm but firm. Because if I did, I'd be no better than the man you think I am. And because I've seen what happens when you let the anger win. It doesn't fix anything, it just makes the scars deeper. Renan looked away, his shoulders slumping as the weight of the night settled on him. Miguel turned toward the taxi, his steps deliberate. Cops will be here soon, he said over his shoulder. You'll have to answer for what you've done. But maybe, just maybe, you can figure out how to make it right. Renan didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the ground. Miguel climbed into the taxi, his mind heavy with the stories they'd shared. Renan was a criminal, yes, but he was also a man shaped by a broken world, a world Miguel was all too familiar with. As Miguel drove away, he glanced at the empty seat beside him. He thought of Sofia, of the promises he'd made to her and to himself. Tonight had tested him, but he was still standing. And that had to mean something. The abandoned warehouse loomed ahead, its rusted frame casting jagged shadows under the pale moonlight. Miguel parked the taxi a block away, his fingers brushing against the steering wheel as he considered what lay ahead. This was it, the culmination of a night that had tested every fiber of his resolve. He couldn't leave it unfinished. Sofia's safety, his promise to himself, and even a sliver of hope for Renan all rested on what he chose to do next. Miguel approached the warehouse silently, his footsteps absorbed by the thick layer of dust and debris surrounding the structure. Inside, faint voices echoed, sharp and tense. He peered through a cracked window and spotted Renan pacing, his phone pressed to his ear. The conversation was heated, his frustration palpable even through the glass. Renan wasn't alone. Two men stood nearby, their postures rigid, hands resting on their waists where Miguel assumed weapons were holstered. These weren't desperate kids, they were professionals, and that raised the stakes. Miguel slipped inside, moving through the shadows with practiced precision. His breath was steady, his focus sharp. Every step brought him closer to Renan, who ended his call with a harsh expletive and slammed the phone onto a rusted table. "Where the hell are they?" Renan muttered, running a hand through his hair. One of the men glanced at him but said nothing. Miguel stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tense air like a blade. "They're not coming." The room froze as all eyes turned to him. Renan's face twisted in a mix of shock and anger. "You!" he growled. "You've got some nerve showing up here." Miguel kept his stance relaxed but ready, his eyes scanning the room for exits and weapons. "This ends now, Renan. You've got nothing left to gain." Renan barked a laugh, though it lacked conviction. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about me. It's about survival, my family." "I know," Miguel interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "I know what you're fighting for. But this isn't the way. You're only making things worse for them and for yourself." The two hired men exchanged glances, clearly uncertain about how to handle the unexpected confrontation. Renan, however, was far from backing down. He stepped closer, his fists clenched at his sides. "Don't act like you're better than me," he hissed. "You don't know what it's like to watch everything you care about slip away." Miguel's voice softened, but his resolve remained unshaken. "I do. I've lived it, and I made the same mistakes you're making now. I lost people I cared about because I thought violence was the answer. Don't let it take everything from you, too." Renan faltered, the anger in his eyes flickering like a dying flame. For a brief moment, Miguel thought he might have reached him. But then Renan's face hardened and he lunged for a knife on the table. Miguel reacted instantly, sidestepping the attack and using Renan's momentum to slam him against the wall. The knife clattered to the floor as Miguel pinned Renan's arm behind his back. "Enough!" Miguel barked, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "You don't want to do this, and you know it." Renan struggled for a moment before going still, his breath ragged. "What choice do I have?" he muttered, the fight draining from his voice. "You always have a choice," Miguel said, releasing him and stepping back. "Do something different, for your family, for yourself. This path doesn't lead anywhere but destruction." The sound of approaching sirens broke the silence, their wails growing louder with every passing second. Renan's shoulders slumped as he realized the reality of his situation. The hired men bolted, disappearing into the shadows before the police could arrive. Renan turned to Miguel, his expression a mix of bitterness and resignation. "What happens now?" "That's up to you," Miguel replied. "You can either keep running or you can face the consequences and try to fix what's broken." The warehouse doors burst open, and officers flooded in, their weapons drawn. Miguel raised his hands, stepping aside as they surrounded Renan. The younger man didn't resist. His head bowed as he allowed himself to be taken into custody. As the chaos settled, Miguel spotted Sofia standing outside the police perimeter, her face pale but determined. She had called the police, ensuring her father wasn't alone in this final confrontation. Miguel approached her, his heart heavy but grateful. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Miguel nodded, pulling her into a tight embrace. "I am now." The weight of the night pressed against him, but for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. He had faced his past, made his choice, and come out the other side. There were still scars, there always would be, but now he was ready to start healing. The morning sun peeked over the city's skyline, its warm rays cutting through the chill of the night. Miguel sat on the edge of Sofia's bed, watching as she slept soundly for the first time in weeks. The faint lines of worry that usually creased her brow had softened. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, a faint smile tugging at his lips. She was safe. That was all that mattered. Quietly, he rose and stepped into the kitchen. The small apartment felt like a sanctuary in the daylight, though the echoes of the previous night lingered in the corners. Miguel brewed a pot of coffee, the familiar routine grounding him. The world outside had changed, but here, within these walls, there was still peace. As he sipped from his mug, his thoughts wandered to Renan. The young man had made his choice, surrendering without resistance. Miguel could only hope the time ahead would give him the clarity to break free from the cycle he was trapped in. He had seen something in Renan, an ember of decency buried beneath layers of anger and desperation. It was a reminder of how thin the line could be between right and wrong. The sound of footsteps pulled him from his reverie. Sofia stood in the doorway, her arms crossed and her expression a mix of concern and relief. "You didn't sleep," she said softly, noting the exhaustion etched into his face. Miguel smiled faintly. "Didn't need to. Seeing you safe is enough." She stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him in a tight embrace. "I was so scared, Dad," she whispered. I thought I might lose you." "You'll never lose me," Miguel said, his voice steady despite the lump forming in his throat. "I promise you that." After breakfast, Miguel walked Sofia to school, their conversation light but meaningful. He encouraged her to focus on her studies, reminding her that the future was still hers to shape. As they parted ways, Miguel felt a renewed sense of purpose. Protecting Sofia wasn't just about shielding her from danger, it was about giving her the tools to thrive. Later that afternoon, Miguel stood outside a modest community center. The sign above the entrance read, "Veterans Support Group, all welcome." He hesitated for a moment, his fingers brushing the scars on his hands, the invisible wounds beneath his skin aching at the thought of reopening old memories. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. Inside, a circle of chairs had been arranged. A small group of men and women engaged in quiet conversation. One man, older but with a familiar steadiness in his posture, looked up and froze. Recognition flashed in his eyes, followed by a broad smile. "Miguel," the man said, standing. "It's been a long time." Miguel's lips curved into a small, genuine smile. "It has, Carlos." The two men clasped hands, the weight of shared history unspoken but understood. Miguel felt a sense of relief he hadn't expected. This was the first step, the beginning of something new. As the group settled in, Miguel introduced himself, sharing a brief glimpse of his story. He spoke of mistakes, of loss, and of the night that had brought him to the edge and pulled him back. The others listened, their nods and murmurs of understanding offering a comfort Miguel hadn't felt in years. When the meeting ended, Carlos approached, his hand resting on Miguel's shoulder. "You've still got fight in you," he said, "maybe more than ever." Miguel nodded, the weight on his chest lifting ever so slightly. For the first time in a long time, he felt like the man he used to be, the man he wanted to be. Walking out into the sunlight, Miguel felt a sense of clarity. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was a road worth walking, for Sofia, for himself, and for the chance to leave the shadows of his past behind. As he turned the corner, the city stretched out before him, a canvas of second chances waiting to be painted. And Miguel, with every step, was ready to begin again. Life often forces us to confront our past in ways we least expect, and for Miguel, that meant rediscovering the strength to protect what truly mattered without losing himself in the process. His journey teaches us that even in the face of danger and desperation, we have the power to choose who we become. So, how would you have handled Miguel's impossible night? Would you have fought back or taken another path? Click on the video on the screen to continue this journey of self-discovery and explore more stories that challenge our decisions and values. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more thought-provoking tales and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next story.